Real quick, as people are coming in, I just want to make sure I've got the pronunciation of folks' names right here. I've got Dr. David Adler, Lane Dyla,
Dilla.
and Tracy Madsen.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start letting them in, okay?
All right. In the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the session Research Early in Your Career, the Society of Academic Emergency Medicine's Research Committee in collaboration with the Research Learning Series. My name is Cole Lettingoff. I'm a medical student and a member of the Research Committee. I'm excited to have with me three really phenomenal researchers who are all active members of SAEM. Dr. David Adler, the University of Rochester, Dr. Lane Della from University of Colorado, Dr. Trailey from Brown University. Real quickly, here's our plan for attack here. We're going to hand it over to each one of these speakers individually. We're going to let them briefly introduce themselves. And we've got some sort of guiding questions, fundamental questions about research and how they've incorporated in their career. And then the last half of our presentation, we'll be focusing on a series of scenarios and getting some general advice about ways that we can incorporate research early on in our careers in emergency medicine. So without further ado, here are our fundamental questions. Why did you decide to make research part of your career? How did you get started in research? And what helped you the most? And I remind all of our panelists that feel free to go off script or guide this conversation however you want. These are just to get the conversation started. And we will start with Dr. David Adler.
Thanks, Cole. Hi, everybody. Good evening or good afternoon, I guess, if you're out west. My name's Dave Adler. I'm an emergency physician and the vice chair of emergency medicine research at the University of Rochester. I went to med school in California and San Francisco and did my EM residency in Oakland, California. Never did a fellowship of any sort, although after residency, I did go back to school and get a master's in public health. My research area of focus is about promoting cancer screening among ED patients who are disproportionately underscreened relative to the general population. I'm also interested in clinical trials in general and trying to facilitate the work of multi-center work that our ED is participating in. Cole, did you want me to go and answer those fundamental questions or introductions first?
Why don't we go ahead and answer those fundamental questions while we've got you there? And
sure. Why did I make research part of my career? It's not that easy for me to answer because it's been so long ago. It's hard to put yourself, in the shoes you wore 20 or 25 years ago. But I think why I'm happy to have it in my career is that I think in our field, it's something that can really promote longevity in the field, to have something like that really balances out clinical work. And it's just so complementary to the parts of your brain that you use working in the emergency department. When you're in the ED, it's just like little wheels spinning really fast. And when you're doing research, it's big wheels spinning really slowly. It's a different type of teamwork, but it's still really team oriented. There's almost no one who does research alone. So I think career satisfaction and longevity and just using a different part of my brain in my professional setting is why I do it. Getting started in research, how did that really happen? It was more of an opportunistic thing for me. I was not thinking I was going to do that as a resident, but I did get a sense later on in my third and fourth year of residency that I did want more than just a clinical career. That's why I went to public health school, sort of aimlessly. But turns out that an MPH is a kind of a research-oriented degree. You learn some research methods and study design stuff. And then my pathway in research was a pretty conventional one. Kind of started out doing pilot work, used the pilot work to eventually, with lots of failure along the way, get a career development award, and then built from that to get more independent research funding. And what helped the most? The thing that helps the most is persistence. I think research it's a tough career in the sense that it tends to be filled with failure. There's a lot of things you try to achieve and you put a ton of effort into getting, and it doesn't work out for you. But you really do, I think, in research, learn from your failures. You do get better and better at conveying your ideas and refining your ideas as your initial ideas get rejected by some review panel someplace. So I would go with persistence as the thing that helps the most. Thanks.
Beautifully said, and especially for our students who are staring down step 1, step 2, something like that right now, persistence is a great reminder for all that we do in medicine. Next up, we've got Dr. Della.
Yeah, so why I chose the research career, I think for me, I was very much a basic science person when I started in undergrad, and I loved the idea of kind of thinking through processes and how, if you really understood the biology of a disease, that could actually inform how you treat patients. So I would definitely echo Dave's sentiment of it does promote longevity and it does kind of complement what we do in the clinic setting. I feel the other thing that's so important about research that really keeps me invested in it, despite the numerous setbacks and that kind of stuff that you'll face, is that when you're in the ED, you get that one-on-one interaction with a patient. It's really gratifying to know that with your research, you have a potential to influence a very broad population. And some of those we may see in our own, but many of those we won't see. And yet we can still have a very positive impact on those. In terms of getting started in research and my pathway in research, it was not direct by any means. So I did a basic MD, PhD, basic science research in cancer biology. And it was mouse models, cell cultures, that kind of stuff. And I really enjoyed, like I said, learning the pathways and how that could influence treatments. But when it came down to it, I didn't want to be an oncologist. And so I went into as an emergency medicine physician, trying to figure out how I could merge the two. And I was very lucky that I had some great mentors, Dave being one of them, that kind of helped me figure out how to take a more clinical spin on the research, and then allowed me to actually do a combined experimental therapeutics and SAM approved fellowship at Rochester. And then from there, I've just continued it. And now as an assistant professor at Colorado. What I say helps the most are two things: is definitely persistence and being able and willing to look critically at the feedback when you do get rejected, because you will get rejected over and over. That is the nature of research. But it gives you an opportunity to take the critiques that you get with those rejections and to refine your ideas to make them better. The other thing that I think really helps is collaborations and having a team, because we aren't doing this in isolation. And so having people that you know and trust that are interested in your work, that you can have them look at stuff beforehand and then build larger research programs with them.
Sounds like us, ambitious goals, but something we can all aspire to there. With that, we're going to hand it off to Dr. Madsen.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. As mentioned, I'm an emergency physician at Brown University. I have a secondary appointment in epidemiology, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And I'm the vice chair of research in our department. And so the first question, I think, was, how did you become interested in research? And I agree with the other panelists that, or with Dave especially, I guess, that it feels like so long ago. Like, why did I start this path? But it really has always been part of my drive to be in medicine, to kind of ask questions and figure out how I can use research to improve care for the patients. And my particular area of expertise is around sex and gender medicine and stroke in particular. And so my interest really stemmed from an interest in women's health. I've been interested in the health of women for as long as I can remember. So thinking about biologic sex, thinking about gender, and my interest really started all the way back in high school or college. And I would volunteer at like the domestic violence shelter and do kind of really traditional like women's health type of initiatives. And then I knew that I wanted to continue down the path of women's health. I did some bench research in undergrad, looking at hormones and SERMs, which are selective estrogen receptor modulators. So I was like very much like into traditional women's health, did some basic science research. And then when it came time to apply for residency, I had done I had kind of done my shadowing, et cetera. And I knew that I wanted to do emergency medicine because I really loved the pace and I really love the variety. And I love being able to really take care of anybody with any problem. But I knew that I had to pursue this women's health interest in some way. And so I kind of did all my interviews. I knew I didn't want to be an OB, and I was trying to explain that to all the residency directors, like, no, I don't want to be an OB. I want to study women's health and I want to be an emergency medicine physician. And I didn't even know quite what that looked like. So it's been a little bit circuitous, but I found a program that had mentors and people that could guide me in how to integrate my academic interest in women's health and how I could build a research career on that while being an emergency medicine physician. And so that's really what drove me to continue the path kind of down the research career, despite the challenges along the way, that thinking about sex and gender differences and how I can better care for our patients in the ED is really what makes me excited to do my research and makes me excited to go take care of patients in the emergency department. So that's a kind of a long-winded answer, but it's really stemmed for me around women's health. And then In terms of my path or kind of how I got started, I mentioned that I started kind of dabbling and did some bench research in undergrad and then did my residency. And so during residency, I really tried to prioritize doing some projects in clinical research to see if I liked clinical research and how could I fit that into emergency medicine. So I found mentors, and I'll talk about that in a little bit with kind of what matters most, but I found some mentors. I found some projects that I was really excited about and that were feasible for a resident to do. So like chart review projects, data abstraction, things that don't necessarily need a lot of funding, and just started doing some clinical research projects in residency. I knew then that I wanted to also do a research fellowship, that I wanted some advanced training in biostatistics and methods, et cetera. So I kind of designed my own research fellowship in sex and gender. We had a division of sex and gender that had just started. And so I was really excited to be able to kind of design a fellowship program that met my needs. And so during my fellowship program, I did a master's in clinical and translational research to get some of that more advanced knowledge around biostats and study design and epi. And that was amazing to have 2 years to really balance work with learning research methods. And so I did the fellowship. I did a pretty traditional career from there in terms of the research path. I applied for a career development award. I failed many times. And that's, again, perseverance kind of ties back to Elaine and Dave. That is number one. I applied for a K 4 times. I thought I was never going to get it, but I was not ready to give up because it's I knew that I was going to keep doing the work. So might as well keep applying for the funding. So anyway, I applied 4 times, got the career development award, went back to school again, much to the dismay of my family, and did a PhD in epi. And I'm kind of joking about that. My family's been very supportive, but I felt like I really wanted even more advanced epi knowledge. And that has also served me well. So I've done a pretty traditional career path since I decided to kind of go down this road. And I'm at the tail end of a career development award and currently applying for R01s, et cetera, which is also a very stressful time, but also very exciting. And I've kind of mentioned some of these things that matter the most along the way. Perseverance has already been mentioned, but I'll just say the other big thing that really has mattered for my career is finding people that will support me, mentor me, and sponsor me. And I'll just say, and I think we'll talk about this during the scenario, is that it doesn't have to be all at your institution. I've kind of built a network of mentors around the country that has supported my career over the years. And without those people, I would not have been successful to this point. So I'm very grateful for my mentors and my sponsors.
Very cool. I loved your comment about being attracted to EM for this ability to sort of see anyone for anything, that incredible breadth of things that we see within the scope of EM, and still being able to do specialized research within that big umbrella. I think that's really quite cool. I know we've hit on a lot of really incredible topics, a lot of things I'm sure have generated some questions. We will have a few minutes towards the end to answer those questions. I suspect some of them may get answered as we go through these sort of mock scenarios. But if you're worried you're going to forget your question, feel free to shoot it in the chat. You can also direct message it to me if you don't want to be known with your question. So we're going to transition into our scenarios here. Our first scenario here, which I know we've got a couple of folks on the call today who sort of fall into this bucket. They're still in med school, so they've still got a lot of learning to go, haven't even reached that point in time where they're applying for a match yet. So maybe second year, third year, somewhere in there. They know they care about EM, they love EM, they love the niche that is in there. They're interested in research, but they haven't really reached that point in time in which they've got something really specific that they care about, but they know that they want research to be a part of their career. They're excited about expanding that pool of knowledge. Much like some of you guys discussed really early in your career, they don't have a ton of research skills or experience. I know we dabble a little bit in some statistical stuff in most med schools, but beyond that, that's really sort of the limit to it. And then they're starting to ask those questions of, when I go to residency, do I want to be at some institution that's got a really big research track record? To what degree does that kind of thing matter? So really unique scenario. I guess really not all that unique scenario. We've got a bunch of people like that, but cool scenario that I'm sure some people identify with. What kind of advice would you guys give them? And Dr. Della, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so this kind of resonates with me a little bit, just because as I was going into residency, having come out of the cancer bio research, I didn't know how or what I was going to study initially. So I think the big thing is not to worry about that, because as you go through residency, you will find your area of interest. one of the things that helped me is I started to focus on what are some research skills that I would like to have for when I do research. So I had some basic science skills, and I decided, so I've tried that a little bit, and I think it's reasonable to then look at, is there a project that I can do? Is it going to teach me something? Even if it just means, okay, I now know how to do a chart review, or I know how to do an IRB to get approval to do human subjects research. I don't think it necessarily matters the topic. You'll find something that will come to you as long as you're getting in there and actually doing work and doing it with people that you enjoy working with. That's the other thing. Because if you're struggling with the personal interactions, I think that can leave a bad taste for research in your mouth. And so just having a team that you enjoy and can work well with will serve you well.
Dr. Mattson, anything you want to add there?
Sure. I would just say that kind of have reasonable expectations for yourself. Residency is hard. It's hard to be a resident without the research. So it's even harder to try to fit research into residency. And I do think like you might come across that case that really interests you, or maybe it's a series of cases that really gets you like invested in a research question. So it doesn't have to happen right away. It can be an organic process, and finding projects that are feasible for a resident is really key. And so kind of finding someone in your residency to help you navigate some projects that might be feasible for you. But really just like maintaining some reasonable expectations for yourself, because it's a busy time.
Reasonable expectations, always a good reminder for us. Dr. Adler, did you want to add anything there about that time during med school?
Yeah, I want to just pick up on one thing that Lane said that I think is really important, and that's, for lack of a better term, about being kind of opportunistic. If there's a good opportunity for you to join a research team, a faculty member, or someone senior to you or more experienced than you, you should really take a good look at that, regardless of what the content area is. In your mind, you might think like, I really love infectious diseases, and this person is more interested in, I don't know, bone healing or something like that. Because having a positive experience where you get exposed to things like the structure of a research protocol, the other elements that Lane said, it is really a really important part of it, and will give you a taste for what research is really like, how the basic blocking and tackling of this stuff gets done, regardless of what your content area is. And plus, you might be pleasantly surprised that you're interested in other stuff when you get more depth. Just thinking earlier in your med school career, also prior to residency, if you're trying to get some exposure, this is where you can make the Office of Medical Education at your medical school work for you. You know, usually it might be the Dean of Student Affairs or a Dean of Student Life or or like an enrichment programs office or something like that. But there are people in the Office of Medical Education that can help you identify opportunities if you don't have any leads. And they might be things that you can execute during a student elective and get credit for. There might be research student employment opportunities over the summer, or maybe even during a long vacation over your first couple of years of medical school. And there may be some summer programs or research funding that gets offered through your university somehow specifically for students. And you just want to, that's the kind of thing you might hear from other students. But if you've got questions, go to the Office of Medical Education, sit down with someone and learn about what the medical school can do for you to help you find a good research opportunity as a medical student.
Great advice. Definitely play those resources there. I know most of the folks who are on the call here are already SAM members, but within RAMS, our resident medical student section here, we've got committees that are engaged in this kind of work. We've got residents, we've got fellows who are eager to give you some advice along the way as well. You'd be surprised at how many students you may find who are engaged in this and really eager to pull you along with them. So now we're transitioning. We've managed to graduate medical school by some sort of miracle. We're moving into residency. We're early in our residency, PG1, PG2. We know that we've got that requirement. We've got to check at some point of doing a scholarly activity, whatever sort of guidance our institution may or may not have about that. But we're starting to think about with the degree to which we want to incorporate research as a big part of our career, including starting to think about, do I want to apply for a research fellowship in just a year or two? So Dr. Mattson, why don't we start with you? What kind of advice would you give a resident in this position?
Sure. So I think it's somewhat variable in terms of how much do you envision research being part of your career, like a little bit, moderate amount, a lot. And that's going to depend, that's going to be different for every person. One thing that I think I did during residency and is important to do is find faculty members, not just at your shop, but like other institutions, look at people's careers and figure out like what type of career are you kind of attracted to. Find role models for yourself and look at their careers and figure out kind of in 5, 10, 15 years, what do you want your career to look like? And that can help you I think, figure out, do you need a research fellowship or can you go straight into an attending position? I felt lucky to have several role models within my department and outside my department that had this path that I could see myself on. And so I could kind of see the steps, and that included doing some research in residency, as I mentioned, doing some projects starting early on, but feasible for a resident, and then starting to look at research fellowships because I knew that that's what I wanted to do. But that's definitely not for everybody, and you can certainly embark on a research career without that, but it might just look a little bit different. So I would recommend for residents, I guess kind of the bottom line is talking to as many people as you can, faculty members, mentors, role models, about kind of how they decided, what they decided to do, so you can start building your career.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Dell, anything to add?
Sure. I think for fellowship, the one thing that I would say was extremely beneficial for having the research fellowship was the protected time. I think it's really hard, especially as junior faculty, when you're getting pulled in multiple directions. People will want you to be on committees. They'll want you to help teach residents. They'll want you to teach med students. There'll be a lot of asks of you when you're first starting out. And to be able to say, I have limited capacity and I'm going to focus on my own career right now is something that's unique to research fellowship. The other thing with the research fellowship, I think you have to consider is how much research training you had. And really, like Dr. Madsen said, what does that look like for your career? Because if you're someone who doesn't necessarily want to be writing grants and the PI on grants, then maybe you don't necessarily need that much protection. You don't do that, but yet you can still be very involved in research through other collaborations. So just keeping that in mind, I would say.
And rounding us out, Dr. Adler, I know you've advised quite a few residents who are in a very similar position.
Yeah, I agree with what Tracy and Lane said. I do think it's important, and this is going to really differ and require some self-assessment for you. A research fellowship is going to be a period of time where you work a modest amount clinically. And for some people who are just really doing well clinically, that's not going to be a big problem. For people who maybe feel like they want to use that first and second year after residency ends to really solidify their clinical skills, participating in a fellowship like this could be a little bit problematic because you just don't. I know, for example, the SAEM approved research fellowships restrict clinical work to an average of 12 clinical hours a week, which sounds great when you're a resident. It's thrilling to think of that, but many people often will say that the toughest year of residency is the first year after residency, and they say it for a reason. It's because practicing independently is a challenge, and you do continue learning quite a bit when you're done with residency with new clinical material, more independent, totally independent decision making. And I think for some people, it's getting an intense amount of clinical stuff right after residency is really important to create that great foundation for them to go forward with. I would, thinking about this mock researcher number 2, who hasn't even completed a scholarly activity, although it's certainly possible that when you get into a research fellowship, that level of immersion in it does actually teach you that research isn't for you. That's possible, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But I wouldn't go into it until you've had a pretty good inkling that research is something that really floats your boat. And that might have been experiences you had in medical school, or it might have been experiences beforehand. But during residency, I think, getting a little bit involved in research during residency, having contact with the research faculty at your residency program, I think is really critical. And it's always going to be a leap of faith when you apply for a fellowship and commit to something, your next steps. But I think you want it to be as informed as possible. So you do what you can to expose yourself to the realities of it, because there's a lot of pluses, and then there's some parts of it that just aren't for everybody.
Definitely not for everybody. I know we hear a lot, especially during those first years of residency, that your priority is building those clinical skill sets. You'll get to dabble, then maybe do, and Dr. Madsen mentioned earlier, some examples of things like chart reviews that are a little easier to do while you're still in residency. And hopefully you've got an institution that's supportive and offering some guidance in that arena as well. So we're moving on into residency. We're a little later on, maybe we're our PGY3 or we're in a 4-year program. We have not applied to fellowship. We're starting to think about, what do I want to do next? Do I want to stay at this institution? Do I want to go somewhere else? Do I want to be at someplace that is, tied to university, that is really an academic center? I don't have any funding with me now. Should I be thinking about funding already? I know I want to make research part of my career, but I don't know what that looks like next. And Dr. Adler, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I think when looking at prospective work later in your residency, in the kind of the context of research, whether you're thinking about a fellowship or just wanting to get involved in research outside of a fellowship, you're thinking about academic settings, community hospitals, many other types of hospitals that have no academic affiliations are places where it is really impossible to get too deep into research. You can apply like research skills to QA stuff. You may be able to do some database related research, but certainly human subjects research becomes very, very difficult to do in settings like that, because you just don't have the institutional infrastructure to provide the type of oversight that is required to do it, the ethics oversight in particular. And if you're interested in getting grants or working towards getting grants, there's even all this infrastructure that's required to manage that. Like federal grants need to kind of go through offices that deal with this stuff. There's a lot of regulatory stuff and a lot of oversight, and you need to be at an institution that can provide that for its employees. So joining an institution that doesn't have that kind of infrastructure is going to make it pretty hard for you to get deep into research, especially human subjects research. Working with databases, maybe not so much. That's not something I do, so I don't have as much experience with it. I think another thing when you're looking for jobs, especially if you're thinking about research, you have to have a frank discussion with either the chair or other significant decision makers who make decisions about money. It is really hard to do a lot of research training or getting a lot of research done with a full-time clinical load, even as an attending. You might be thinking like, oh, 14 or 15 shifts a month sounds like a dream. When you're a resident, it probably is a dream, but that's full-time as an EM faculty member. And trying to add on to that, like really learning how to do research or doing complicated stuff and writing a lot, it's kind of impossible to do. So, you want to position yourself to be a viable candidate so that a chair or the other decision makers look at you as someone like, hey, this is worth investing in this person. We're going to protect some of their time, and that costs your chair money. It means they pay you the same, but you work less clinically, and you use that other time to pursue research and research training. If it's a kind of a department where the culture just isn't doing that, then that still might be a cool place for you, but it's not a place where you're given as much opportunity to thrive as a researcher and grow and learn how to do it.
Very interesting. We continue on with Dr. Della.
Yeah, so I think looking for jobs is always hard. I think two things that Dave said that are really important are, one is the infrastructure and the culture of the employment, the hospital that you're going to work at. There are always going to be, if you're an academic setting, I feel like places that will tell you that they can do research and have the infrastructure. What that looks like in a day-to-day assistance with your research is going to be very variable. And so really important to actually talk with the researchers to see what kind of support they do and what as a departmental things can they provide. So does the department have a research assistance program that's enrolling in the ED? That makes your life a lot easier. Does your department have a biostats consultant that you can work with? Those are things that can get very costly. And especially when you're starting out, you're not going to have the budget unless you get really lucky and get a career development award right off the bat. And even those, you usually don't have the budgets for some of those kind of more expensive infrastructure type items that you need. The other thing is, as you're looking for jobs, I think going back to kind of that collaboration is, are you at a place that really has the mentorship structure there for you? Is there someone that has kind of similar interests to you that you can start working on? Being able to get papers out with mentors and build that relationship over time is something that not only does it benefit them and that you write the papers and help get that out, but it really drives your career forward. And being the only person doing whatever type of research makes it just infinitely harder.
Having that institutional support sounds like a key. Dr. Madsen, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things. I think the last point that Lane made is really important. It's not that you can't succeed if you're the only one studying something, but it's so much harder And so if you can find some people that are studying similar topics or topics that you're interested in, it will really help at the beginning of your career to kind of get that publication record going. And then I'll also say, like, in addition to looking for infrastructure, RAs, project coordinators, grants management, all of this, and asking for protected time, if you're planning on writing grants, would be to find out if the institution has opportunities for internal seed funding or small project development grants, something to get you started, because it's very difficult to kind of jump in and just start applying for federal grants. You need some funding those first couple of years to get you started, even if you have the infrastructure in place. So asking about all of those things when you're considering which job to choose.
And I think I just want to piggyback on that. Like when we say like collaborators and mentors, they don't necessarily have to be within your department. I've been very fortunate through all stages that most of my collaborators, because I do stroke research, are not in my department. And I have mentors that are stroke neurologists. So you need to have the conversations with the chair and the department of like, not only within our department who can mentor me, but who else within our broader community is there for us to gain mentorship from.
I think some of that may dovetail nicely into our last researcher here. And in this scenario, it's someone who's graduated residency, has taken their first sort of attending faculty post, whatever, faculty, so they are at some sort of academic center, but they don't have any funding, they don't have any protected time, and they're at an institution that, while it is an academic center, isn't somewhere that has a ton of grant-funded research going on within the Department of Emergency Medicine, doesn't have a big precedent for supporting that kind of thing. Any advice for them trying to break into that world? And I guess last time we started, why don't we start with Dr. Madsen?
Sure. So I think this is kind of like, this isn't ideal if you're really interested in getting your research career started, and it kind of goes with some of the things we said about the mock researcher number 3. But I would say, I mean, there are small things you can do to kind of move things forward as you're trying to figure out, like, do you really want research to be a big part of your career? If so, maybe this isn't the best institution, but this is where you are now, right? And so what can you do while you're there? What can you kind of get started? And I think one thing to consider would be like secondary data analysis. So finding, if you're interested in stroke, for example, finding the rich data sources that already exist and trying to do some secondary analysis, trying to find some collaborators, whether they're in the department of neurology or some other department, maybe not within your department. If your department has limited research experience, that seek people outside your department, seek data that already exist, find feasible ways to get some publications under your belt. And then maybe at that point, you would be like reflecting a little bit about what do you want the rest of your career to look like and where is the best place for that to happen.
Makes a lot of sense. Dr. Adler, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I agree with Tracy that this is a tough situation to be in if you have a lot of ambition towards research. But another thing, in addition to what Tracy said, you do have to remember that there's a lot of different types of researchers from other clinical departments besides emergency medicine who are really interested in the acute care element of whatever their thing is, whether it's a neurology problem or a cardiac problem or it's sepsis or whatever it is. Sometimes it's pain researchers wanting to find people with acute pain, and you have access to that population, so are a valuable collaborator in that way. And the other thing is, you've probably, or maybe you haven't known, but I know that Tracy and Lane know this, people who don't work in the emergency department have no clue how it actually works and what is going on in there. And so as an emergency physician in this scenario, you're going to understand more about how one might operationalize a study that's looking to enroll acute care patients from the ED. So again, you may at least have an opportunity here, even if it's a real steep climb, to initiate some of your own projects because you don't have that departmental support. You could be a really valuable co-investigator to others.
All right, Dr. Adler, our person is a little bit back in their corner here, didn't end up at the right place. Any advice for him?
I mean, I think everything both Tracy and Dave said really is the key points. The only other kind of advice I would say is, I think in these situations, going to national academic emergency conferences or conferences in your area, if it's not primary emergency medicine, even if for like me, it's going to stroke conferences, is almost equally as valuable as going to something like SAM, so that you have opportunities to network. And as intimidating as that is, trying to identify someone at a conference whose poster you're interested in or something like that. Not only can it help establish some potential collaborations while you're at this institution, but it can also help kind of guide you onto what could be your next step and where that might be.
Sounds like some good advice. Always building those connections. That's a common theme throughout all four of these scenarios. So I'm going to pause our screen sharing here just for a moment, and we're going to hit a few of the questions that have come in. And again, if you've got any questions for our panelists, feel free to put them in the chat or direct message them to me, whatever you're more comfortable with. Several really great questions here. I want to start with what's really a softball for Dr. Madsen, but something that's an interesting question. What is a secondary appointment and what does that mean?
Yeah, so essentially when you get an academic appointment at whatever job you choose, you usually have, if it's an academic job, you have an appointment with the Department of Emergency Medicine. And then this setup might be different depending on the institution, but that's typically affiliated with a medical school, right? And so there are other departments. So for me, I collaborate a lot with the stroke neurologist. I collaborate a lot with the epidemiologist over at the School of Public Health. And so often people might seek a secondary appointment or kind of another appointment in another department if your have really grown. And so it's just kind of, it's mostly on paper, but it's a nice way to kind of solidify collaborations and potentially access to resources in other departments.
I think that ties nicely into a couple of questions here that we've got. Our senior residents are starting to think about what comes after residency. They all sort of swarm around this idea of looking at appointments. Does your initial appointment need to be somewhere, or is it preferable for it to be somewhere where you were interested in being long-term? You know, we don't see a lot of folks who are still entering sort of those traditional tenure tracks anymore, but is somewhere where you can lay down roots, build out an infrastructure, maybe even build out a lab. Is that kind of thing valuable? And then does it matter what your appointment is, other than sort of rank and prestige within the institution? Does something like a title of associate professor versus instructor, does that realistically matter? Dr. Adler, why don't you start us off there?
I guess I'll start with the second half first. You know, the promotion structure, you know, I think it might be somewhat idiosyncratic to the institution, but you don't have a lot of control over your initial appointment coming out of residency. Most places, and again, there's some variety here, but in a lot of places, you're going to start out as an instructor. The kind of classic road is instructor, then senior instructor, then assistant, then associate, and then professor. There's going to be time duration specified in your institution's faculty handbook. Honestly, I wouldn't get that hung up on it. I would inform myself about it so I understood at my institution what was going on. And I would also want to understand, I think there are some institutions where benefits change a little bit as your rank goes up, maybe not all of them, but I wouldn't get too hung up on it. And you're just going to seem like you're coming way out of left field to be like, you know, I should be an associate. And it's like, no, you just got out of residency. You're not going to be an associate for a while. What was the first part of the question, Cole?
You know, should you be aiming for an institution where you're interested in being long-term? Is there some value to be able to lay down those roots?
You know, my understanding is that most people do end up getting a lot of different jobs over the first several periods of the year. That was certainly the case for me. I got out of residency, was going to school, but worked in a couple of different community positions, then got hired back as academic faculty at the place where I trained, and then spent a few years there and then moved to Rochester, which is my hometown and where my parents were at the time, and have been here ever since. But I didn't necessarily come here thinking like, I'm going to stay there forever. It's just the way things sort of worked out.
Dr. Madsen, you look like you had something you wanted to add there.
Oh, I'll just add that. I mean, that's hard to predict. I think you have to figure out where you need to be kind of in the immediate short term. It's hard to predict what you're going to need in 5 years, both personally or professionally. So I wouldn't stress too much about I have to find the place that I'm going to be for the next 10 years. That would be very challenging.
Makes sense, especially in a world in which most of us have no idea what it's going to look like in 10 years. Dr. Dillard, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, I think changing institutions, especially once you have a grant, having done that, it sets your grant back. And as much as everybody will tell you, oh, you're gonna be back or you're gonna lose a year in your research, and you will resist it every step of the way, like I did. It does. It sets your research back a year when you change institutions or somewhere around there, because you've got to reestablish collaborations, reestablish operating protocols. Maybe if you're doing secondary data analysis, Tracy would probably know better than I. Maybe it's not as big of a deal, but if you're doing human subjects research, you're going to take a hit. So keeping that in mind doesn't mean that you're not going to change institutions. I'm sure we will all change institutions based on where our lives take us. But I do think that you don't want to necessarily just take the first job without really thinking about caveat of it. And then in terms of like what Dave was saying about the promotions and the faculty structure, that is so variable from institution to institution. I know for Colorado has a very structured plan, and they really emphasize that you are always on track for promotions. Every year we go up, we have a large discussion about what rank you are now, when are you moving to the next rank, what do you need to get to the next rank. Whereas Rochester, it was not quite as big of a deal. It was still emphasized and you want to be growing, but that the emphasis that an institution is going to place on that is highly variable.
Another question here, how much of your time is spent clinically versus in research versus in administration if you have an administrative role? Dr. Adler, I know you spend quite a bit of time admittedly. Would you like to start us off there?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but if I was guessing, I think I work about one clinical day a week. So I guess you could call that 20% clinical, and then maybe 50% research and 30% administrative, education, other.
So is that something that is, I guess, set in your contract, or is that vary based on funding streams?
Funding
Like that year?
streams, some of it is contractual, some of it is an understanding. But I can tell you, like, it takes a really, really long time. I mean, a career development award, if you get one, the regulations are likely that it protects a huge amount of your time, probably 50% or more. But it takes a long time to get a research career really rolling, like a long time, many years.
Dr. Dill, I see you smiling at that thought there. Do you want to add something?
I mean, I think the research, having the benefit of having a K or a career development award is that it does protect you. Same thing with fellowships. So most Ks are 75% protected time for research, which limits for us most, or at least our institution, is no more than 6 to 7 shifts a month. So it significantly reduces it. Currently, I have 75% buy down. That will change within the next 6 months, and I will go to 50% buy down just based on the nature of what grants I have. And that continuously gets reassessed as I get grants or don't get a grant. And then for me, I probably only have like 5% administrative because I'm just not into that as much. And I'm not at that stage yet. And then the rest is just research or clinical.
Similar to what's been said, I'm at the tail end of a career development award. So I've been just about 75% for the past almost 5 years. And then I just took this vice chair of research role. So I'm headed into some more admin time and then about 1 clinical shift a week.
Feels a little bit like juggling, trying to keep all the pieces in line there. Dr. Matson, we're going to stay on you to start with this next question. Do you feel like an advanced degree, master's, PhD, something like that, made you more competitive for grant funding?
I hope so. I think it did. I think it gives you some clout maybe that you wouldn't have otherwise. It also gives you skills. I really feel like I learned a lot of content and a lot of skills that I would not have otherwise. And that's why I kept kind of like going back and getting more knowledge around biostats and epi, because I really wanted those advanced skills. And I felt that was really necessary for me to write high level grants. That being said, research is a team sport. And so even if you do have an advanced degree, you're still going to be working with biostatisticians and colleagues who know more than you in a certain area of study design or analysis or whatever. So I think it's really important. It has been for my career to kind of grow those collaborations and write high level grants. But keep in mind that it's not, I mean, you can still do research without advanced degrees. You're going to be working with biostatisticians and other team members regardless.
There's some of the folks on the call are excited to hear that they can push some of that statistics work off onto someone else. Dr. Adler, I know you got what you I think described as almost a quasi technical degree in your MPH there. Did you find it to be helpful?
Yeah, I do think it's more about the skills and the exposure to the concepts than just the credential. I can tell you, like, I've had the opportunity to be on panels reviewing others' grants. And I don't think I'm putting a whole lot of emphasis on the degrees. I'm more looking at what the person has accomplished scientifically. And if you can do that independent of a degree, that's cool. But you do need to learn how to do research somewhere because they don't teach you in medical school. Doctors are not particularly good at research.
Very true. I'm afraid. You mentioned that you wanted to be able to see some track record of being able to do science. Is that traditional academic productivity? Or are you looking at the number of number of conference presentations, number of publications, that kind of thing? Is there a quality versus quantity balance?
There is a balance. I'm not sure where it is. I think quality is more important than quantity, but there's kind of a minimum quantity that makes it look like you've been productive and collaborative.
Still, I know you were almost at the opposite of the spectrum, though. You had your PhD at the same time you had your MD. I'm sure that framed how you approached residency and beyond. Do you find it helpful?
I think it goes back to the skills. The research I do now is not at all relative to the PhD, but the skills I learned from the PhD and how to think critically about a problem and how to really think through what is the hypothesis, can you test that hypothesis, were extremely helpful. That being said, I ended up going back with fellowship and getting a master's in clinical science investigation because I needed more clinical research skills that I didn't have. So yeah, it doesn't just end with the degree, even if you get a PhD or whatever it is, it's the skills.
We've so used this term skills a lot here, and earlier we talked about how, if you do potentially even of doing a research fellowship early on might hurt some of your clinical skills. You find that those research skills and clinical skills are divergent. You sort of have to choose between being really good at one or the other.
I don't think so. I mean, I think there is always going to be something that suffers a little bit. If you're not 100% in the clinic, I'm not as efficient. I'm not as clinically savvy as some of my colleagues who are 100%. That being said, I don't think I'm a bad doctor. I think I'm still an okay doctor. There are going to be times when I have to go for help in the clinical aspect. Same thing for the research. If I was 100% research, I'm sure I would be better and more efficient at writing the grants and getting grants and that kind of stuff. But there would still be times that I had to go for help from somebody else. And so I think it's just a balance.
I think I'd be a little worried if you sat here and said, I never had to ask for help for anyone in the ED. It would be concerning.
I just want to add one thing to that. There are times I think for a lot of physician scientists, when you're sitting in a room with a lot of like pure scientists, like hardcore PhD, like just, trained in research, unlike physicians who are trained in taking care of the patient in front of them, you can feel sort of a sense of insecurity, inferiority, or imposter syndrome. But at the same time, especially if you're talking about clinical research, there are things it really understand as physicians who take care of humans, provide so much insight into how clinical research should be done, can be done, what are meaningful questions and what aren't. So they really are complementary skills, but it's a lot to take on, and that's why it takes a lot of time.
I'll just add one thing to that. I think, like Lane said, you sometimes feel like you're not perfect at either one because you're kind of split between two. Sometimes it almost feels like two jobs, not always, but sometimes it feels like two separate jobs that you're doing. But honestly, that's something that I love about it because it really does and has so far, for me, enabled me to stay in a career in emergency medicine and be really happy with my career. And I think that it'll continue to help me with longevity in emergency medicine. And I really enjoy kind of doing one day of clinical work and then going back to my research for a couple of days and then back to the clinic. And I really enjoy the balance and kind of the back and forth that keeps things interesting and fun.
I love that idea of the balance, promoting sort of running from burnout there. I know we're approaching the end of our hour here, so we're going to wrap up with our final question. But first, I want to thank you all for joining us. I know you've got a billion other things on your plate, a billion other places to be, and not to mention home or doing nothing at all. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and the continued mentorship that you provide to all of us across SAN and beyond. We're really lucky to have you guys. So we are going to end with our final thought here, and that's just really briefly what you wish you had known when you were starting your career in research. Dr. Adler, why don't we start with you?
I think I'll just go back to the first thing, that there's just tons and tons of failure along the road in research. One mentor told me long ago, I probably mentioned this to Lane, so she's going to hear this quotation again from me. He said to me, if you don't have a drawer full of failed grant applications, you're not trying really hard to be a researcher.
He definitely has told me that. And I think back on it regularly at this point in my career, because every time I get rejected or something like that, which a lot lately, it seems like, I remember, I'm like, I am trying. I'm putting in a grant every couple months, it seems like at this point. That's the nature of it. I wish I had known how much writing I was going to be doing as a researcher. I thought I was going to be more in the science, in the lab, interacting with patients. And I do a lot more writing, which I have grown to enjoy the more I do it, but it's not quite what I expected.
Yeah, so just, I know we're up against the clock here, but just very quickly, I guess the thing that I wish I would have known is that emergency medicine research can really span a huge number of topics and methodologies. And that's something that's really cool about emergency medicine specifically, is that we can choose research topics from almost any kind of subspecialty, if you will, because we take care of everything in the emergency department. And when I first started on my career, on my research career, I was kind of worried about, like, does my work fit into this nice little emergency medicine box? And I felt like maybe it didn't, with my interest in women's health and all of this. And the longer that I've been in it, the more that I realized that we can really study anything as emergency medicine physicians, and that we have a really cool vantage point from the clinical side and can see a really unique perspective and have unique research questions.
Well, unfortunately, I think we may have opened more questions than we've answered here. So many opportunities with emergency medicine research and beyond, so many incredible things to get involved with. It's a really exciting time to be entering this field. Thank you again to all of you for joining us, both as panelists and as well to our audience. This recording, along with all the other recordings of the research learning series, will be posted to the SAM YouTube page, where you can also find a series of other great webinars. We hope many of you will join us in person at the SAM annual meeting in Austin, where we'll feature some of the best and cutting edge research from across emergency medicine. Good luck with all of your studies and then getting started in your career in EM research.
Thank you.
Thanks.